Hello and welcome to the Self-Recording Band podcast. I'm your host, Benedikt, and I'm here with my friend and co-host, Malcolm Owen Flood. How are you, buddy?
Hey, man. I'm doing great. How are you?
I'm doing great, too. This was the first time in a long time that I almost stumbled over my words when I did the little introduction there. I couldn't remember your name for a short moment.
Who is this guy?
Yeah.
He keeps showing up once a week.
Yeah, exactly. No, I know who you are. So, and I'm glad to see you.
Yeah, listeners, this was actually meant to be a solo podcast. I just started showing up.
Yep. At some point, Malcolm just showed up, and he, never left after that. So.
I'm always online. You sign in, I'm already here.
Exactly. So, how was your weekend? What did you do? Like anything?
What did I do? I kind of worked through it. I was on a show, but it was nice and chill. A good gig up in Souk, British Columbia, which is a beautiful place that I absolutely love to be. Oceanside community. It's really awesome there. It's like a place I think about trying to move to all the time. So,
oh really?
Pretty solid weekend hanging out there, gotta say. And it was sunny. I got too much sun, I would say, but got to do that at least once in the summer.
Yeah.
Yeah. And there was some music in my week. I finished a few mixes and masters last week, so just kind of was communicating with the artists over the weekend, and we're gonna put the finishing touches on them this week. So things are moving along just dandy in that department too. How about you?
Awesome. Yeah, pretty much same here. Spent a lot of time outside. Enjoying the end of summer, basically, as always, running, stuff like that. And then, and then a lot of music stuff too, of course. It's crazy how like a holiday, like vacation break always changes everything for me in terms of energy and excitement and everything. Before I left, I didn't really feel very exhausted, but when I came back, I realized how exhausted I actually was because like this last week after the vacation, I just got so much done and I was like excited for things again. And I don't know, like it really changed things. So it felt great working on some mixes. I did a little more experimenting than usual just because I wanted to. And so this was a pretty good week. And now this week is going to be a lot about the coaching program, adding new content for my people there, preparing the launch finally for the Mixes Unpacked 2 and stuff like that. So yeah, I feel like I have a lot of energy and a lot of things to do. And I don't mind having a lot of things to do, which is a great feeling.
Exciting.
Yeah.
Yeah. A recharge followed by kind of a more lax week is the perfect combination, I think. Because otherwise, if you like have a little relax period and then go back in and it's like heavy, you've kind of like forgotten your workflow, and then it's like, I got to overcompensate, get back into this thing. But if you can ease back into it, it's like you've got the attitude and the bandwidth is perfect.
Yeah, exactly. Like there was a lot of like catching up and stuff as always, but it wasn't so overwhelming. And now I feel like I'm much faster than before. It almost feels like I didn't lose time just because I get so much done now. It's always the thing with taking breaks. Same during mixing, by the way, people. If you are sitting there for like hours and working on a song and you're afraid that you're going to lose time by taking a break, most often this is not true. Just taking a break and then getting back into it is oftentimes like actually most of the time it's faster than just trying to push through it.
Yeah.
At least in my experience. Yeah.
I agree.
Awesome. And today's episode is, of course, also about music and recording as always. And it's about going the extra mile, basically, to make your vocalist feel as good as possible when it's time to perform. So I called this episode, I don't know if that's going to be the title, but like make your singer feel like a star. And what I mean by that is that the performance, as we often said, matters more than anything, at least in my opinion. And the best mic and the best vocal chain and all the gear and all of that doesn't really matter if the delivery just doesn't cut it. And so what you record has to resonate with the listener. There's got to be a vibe. It just has to feel right. And we need to make sure that a singer we're recording can do his or her best job when it counts. And I think this is true for every instrument, by the way, not just for vocals. But I think this is why I made this episode or this outline about the vocals, because I feel like vocals are such a personal, intimate thing that they are, and they are also the thing that listeners care about most, I'd say. So that I think it's especially important to get a good performance when recording vocals. Yeah, we're going to talk about, besides the typical things, I think we have talked about those too in the past, that this is an episode on its own. Like, besides the typical things like getting the vibe in the room right, communicating well, making sure that the artist has everything they need and all of that, there is one major element that you as an engineer actually have control over, and that is the headphone mix. That is, I think, what can make or break a session almost, or like what can make a person perform really well or do the exact opposite. And you want to make this headphone mix and the song that they're like their own voice, but also the song, the backing track that they're hearing, you want to make it sound as good as possible on the headphones so that they can feel like a star and perform like one. That's basically the topic of this episode. So let's go through what you can and should do to make that happen. And I'm curious to hear your thoughts on that, Malcolm, because you said something very interesting when we were talking about this before the episode. That was kind of a different perspective where you said, like, it's not only about what the artist wants to hear, it also matters what I hear when I'm engineering. And for self-recording bands, this really matters because you're like the engineer, producer, and artist all in one. And like, so I'm really curious to hear about that too. So let's talk about that.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I would say that it usually takes longer to build my headphone mix than the singers, which is, and I try to be really quick so it doesn't. It's like I don't think that's something the singer ever like observes. They're like, oh, it's weird,
Yeah.
but it's probably like, and they don't even know I'm tweaking mine as they're getting warmed up often and stuff like that. But it's definitely something I care about, and we'll dive into why I believe that for sure, and many other things that go into providing the ideal environment and atmosphere for the vocalist to kind of connect and shine. It is not an overrated topic, and you do hear people talk about this and say it's important, but I think because it's like there's a lot of almost mindset to it, people discount it for some reason, and it's really not to be discounted. It's super, super important. Actually, maybe that is a good place to start because it talks about why I care about what I'm hearing, and that also explains why a singer would care about what they're hearing as well, and what's going on around them. So ultimately, even before the performance being everything, the song is everything.
Oh yeah,
and the context of the song and stuff like that. So that is kind of what my philosophy of needing to hear it exactly how I want to hear it boils down to. And when I say that, I mean that I'm kind of hoping for the vocal to sound kind of mixed and in the mix, which usually means it's quieter than the vocalist might want for what they're hearing. And I find other people in the room want it louder too, because everybody likes to have what they're focusing on louder, right? If you're tracking guitars, your guitars are probably louder than they'll be in the finished product, et cetera, et cetera. But with vocals, that's kind of the exception for me. I want it sitting where I think it will be sitting, roughly. I want the effects on it that I think will be pretty close to what the effects will be. So we've got, like a delay that's probably going to be there in the end. The reverb is going to be along the lines of what's going to be there in the end. The compression is like a really good starting point. And especially like the EQ curve of it. Like, is it like a bright vocal? Is it a dark vocal? That's all got to be pretty much figured out for me and in the song so that I can hear it and make decisions on their performance based against the song. If it doesn't sound like it fits in the song, it all kind of sounds lame to me and not inspired. and I have a super hard time being like, oh, like, could you like go more emotional on that line? Or I think you're overdoing it, and it's kind of like a watery vibrato thing you're doing. Let's go softer, dial back, or whatever it is. Or even stuff that's a little more production based, like, you know what, we should double up for this last line leading into the chorus and have a vocal double. Let's just knock it off right now. All of those decisions become really clear to me if the mix is like quotation marks finished sounding.
Yeah.
And so that's what I need to hear, and that's why I want to go through all of that work. But now flip it, and I'm the singer in the room. I also want that, but I think more importantly, a singer wants to hear themselves above all else, right? So they can make sure that their tone and pitch and timing and no weird mouth noises and stuff like that that are happening too. So with that in mind, and something that'll probably come up throughout this episode, for me, and maybe this is a luxury with my system, but I think a lot of systems can do this now, having two different headphone mixes or mixes, I should just say, is really important. So my mix is always different than what the singer is receiving. And I build those, one for me and I build one for them. And that is huge to me. It very, very rarely works out that we both want to hear the same thing.
Absolutely. This is super, super critical. And yeah, it's something that you said there about like you having to hear it in context more and the singer like having to hear it themselves more than anything probably. This alone is a perfect reason to have that separate. It's almost a must, I think. And I wanted to talk about this as a final thought, but I kind of push it to the beginning of the episode now because it makes sense. everything we're going to be talking about in this episode sort of depends, like whether you're able to do all of that depends on the interface, the gear that you have to an extent. So usually we're not like big on like gear, and it's not the most important thing. But I think, being able to do these things that we're going to talk about requires you to have a solid interface, a fast computer, and maybe DSP processing in your interface if you want to run plugins in real time, for example. And I think like the thing about the different headphone mixes, this is one of those things that are probably worth upgrading, where it's like probably worth upgrading to a different interface if you can't do that with yours. Like if yours just has an output and a headphone output and they both spit out the same thing, then that might be a reason to upgrade to something else. And this is stuff like that is much more important than the actual specs or the quality of the preamps or something like that. A lot of people think they have to upgrade their interface because a more expensive interface sounds better, but that's actually not the point, because all of the current gear basically sounds good. I think the point is what you can do with the interface, like the options you have, the flexibility, the ins and outs, the different mixes and all of that, and maybe being able to run plugins and stuff like that. So that is actually what it's about. So if you're wondering how to do the things that we're going to explain, you might be limited by the interface you have, but also there might be workarounds. So if you have a fast enough computer and a decent interface, you could do some of those things inside your DAW instead of on the interface itself. Some of those, at least. The only requirement that you really have to have is like you have to have two different outputs of some sort. Could be a headphone out and a line out, and then you can connect a headphone amp to the line out or something. But two different outputs is like the only requirement on the hardware side. Everything else could be done in the DAW if your computer is fast enough, so you can turn down the latency and all of that. So there's that. There are workarounds, but maybe this is a good reason to upgrade, and definitely a better one than just the Sonics. I just want to say that.
Yeah, that's a great point. And there's also a little bit of a technical proficiency requirement as well. You have to understand the routing matrix of your I/O in your computer and be able to set that up and efficiently be able to run that in the session, because having those two mixes is great and dandy, but if they're asking for a change and it takes you like 15 minutes to figure out how to make that happen for them, and you like make a mistake and you're like, oh, sorry, they just took it out, and like that stuff ruins a session. So it takes practice to kind of get proficient at it. And I would encourage you to, once you have a system you like, try and set that up into a template so you can just kind of pull it in and not have to reroute it every time.
Definitely. And practice that too. Like I have a really, really good interface. I have an RME that has a phenomenal like mixing software that comes with it that you can use to route things. But still, I prefer to, when I was still recording, I still prefer to do most of what I do when it comes to monitoring actually in Cubase, and not so I wouldn't have to run both of those things at once. So I set up a total mix, like this is the interface software. I set that up once basically. And then in the session, I did almost everything out of Cubase. And I could do that because my computer is fast, because the interface is like really solid and fast, and I can get really low latency even though I'm running through the DAW. But I prefer to do that because it's just so much faster to just focus on one piece of software and do the changes there instead of like going back and forth between the two. This just took me too long, and like even though I can work it, like it's still not very efficient. So you definitely have to learn that stuff. You have to practice it, and you have to come up with a workflow that works for you for sure. And the one last thing I want to add here is digital mixers instead of like just quote unquote just an interface can be a great solution for this too, like, or mixes in general, because with a mixer, even with an analog mixer, you can do a lot of the headphone routing and stuff like that even before you ever hit the interface. So some of that stuff could be done without any latency on the mixer, and then you go to the computer. So there might be workarounds, and it's different for every mixer. And especially like digital mixers now, they can give you effects, compression, EQ, whatever you want before you even go to the converters and to the computer, which can be really cool. So the routing capabilities of those, they can be a great solution for what we're going to talk about too. So if you happen to have one of those in your jam space, it might be worth like checking that out and see how it sounds as an interface, and maybe you can then utilize the routing capabilities of it.
Okay, this brings up a fascinating topic. Actually, it's kind of a bit of a rabbit hole that I didn't expect to go down. But there was like these two intangible things that took me a long time to figure out, and I think it's part of why vocalists typically don't like recording or find it very uncomfortable when it's something that's new to them. They throw on headphones and they're like, oh, this is not like singing on stage with a speaker in front of me, or just with my acoustic guitar in my living room, and whatever. It's so different. And I couldn't really figure out how to correct that. But then it kind of boils down to two things, at least partially, and these help this situation. One is a pretty simple fix. It's providing a stereo mix rather than a mono mix. And a stereo mix, means that you've got things spread left and right, and there's a space. And your vocal's probably going to be coming up center, so it kind of has a spot to live. It's not just kind of stacked on everything else. That answers or solves a lot of this unnatural feeling right there. If possible, go with a stereo mix. I really, really think a vocalist will always prefer that. But then the other thing is this weird feeling of your voice is no longer in your body. And you're singing, and it's almost like your voice is like right in front of you. And that is latency, essentially. Latency and phase with your headphones, and that's caused by the delay to some extent as well. So you're hearing it through the headphones, but it's also in you, and that can kind of cancel out a little bit and have a bad phase polarity relationship. So improving the latency will bring it, and this is actually kind of how it feels. It feels like, and you can test this, if you throw up a vocal and you've got a pretty good latency, and then you throw on something that delays the signal on that channel, the more you delay it, the further it feels like your voice is moving away from you. It's fascinating. And then as you shorten it, it feels like your voice is re-entering your head.
Yes.
And then the lower the latency you can get, the more it's going to feel like you're singing it like usual. Which is really helpful, and especially if this is something you're not used to. And then you can always flick the polarity switch, and sometimes that kind of gets it that little bit more solid feeling as well. But then I know there's people that go through huge lengths to make it so that their vocal monitoring is no latency. So they have a hardware pre-computer vocal send that just directs like the raw vocal, essentially splits it right from the mic back to you. And that's like as low as you can get. There's downsides to that as well, I think. But they really value that. Is this like it's immediate. It feels like now. And there's definitely something to be said for that. And it's worth experimenting with to see if you can improve that.
Yeah, totally. Absolutely. And all of what you just said is like part of the list that we're going to go through right now. And the thing with direct monitoring, where you send a hardware, a signal through the hardware to the headphones without latency, without going to the computer and all of that, which is like zero latency. That is what the entry-level interfaces oftentimes offer, that they have a wet-dry knob or something on the front where you can send the direct in signal back to your headphones, and then you can blend that with what's coming back from the computer. And this is kind of a workaround for them not having like the necessary outputs and the mixing software and all that required. And you would think that this is enough and this is cool. And like basically many people listening to this might actually think that the headphone mix is basically about just being able to turn them up loud enough so that they can hear themselves. But the thing is, and this is why there's downsides to that, it's about much more than that. It's not just about you being loud on the headphones. And yes, it is about latency and phase and all that, but it's about how you actually sound on the headphones and how that makes you feel so that you can perform best. And this is where a lot of the cheaper interfaces sometimes don't really cut it, because you're just limited with that. You can turn it up, yes, but it still will sound pretty raw. And this might make some singers feel insecure because they want to hear themselves as they were on a record, and they want to, all these things. So this is why I thought of the title making the singer feel like a star, because that doesn't happen if you just send the raw signal back to the headphones.
Absolutely.
And so let's go through that list real quick. So I think at first, to me, it starts with the very basics, which is make sure that there's no distracting things like hum, noise, hiss, clicks, pops, stuff like that. Just distracting stuff. Make sure that there's nothing like that on the headphones. This includes setting the buffer size correctly so there's no clicks and pops, so that the computer can actually handle the low latency, making sure that the things like the stable connection, like adapters, extension cables, stuff like that. You don't want to have one side go in and out all the time of the headphones. This is a very common thing. You want to have stable connectors. You don't, because that stuff, even if you can fix it, when that starts to happen, even if it just happens once, it makes a singer a little bit more insecure, because they are going to start thinking about, will this happen again? What was that? Is that, this is just not good. These are things that you absolutely want to test and want to avoid. Definitely for every single session. This is the basics, I'd say. And then next up is what you said, Malcolm, no or minimal latency, which is the delay between you hearing yourself from inside your body, basically, and what's coming out of the headphones. And this doesn't have to be, as you said, an obvious echo. This doesn't have to be a huge gap that you can hear like a delay. This is a very short delay that you don't really notice as a delay. Can still be too much if the thing happens that you described, where it feels like the vocal is sort of in front of you. So really try to get that to minimum. And the way to do that is to either do it with the hardware thing that you send back to your headphones, if that's the only thing you can do, or if you go through the computer and a mixing software that the interface comes with, or like if you go through the DAW and use plugins there or whatever, you have to make sure that you set what's called the buffer size inside your software to the lowest possible value that your computer can basically handle. Because the lower you go with the buffer size, the lower the latency will be, but the more your CPU will have to work, and you have to find the sweet spot there, and you have to get that number to as low as possible, and that will reduce your latency. And if your interface comes with processing power built into it, with like a CPU built into it, a DSP chip, then it can oftentimes handle the routing and sometimes effects and all of that without causing additional
CPU
load on the computer. Yeah, exactly. And then you can oftentimes run effects and stuff that in real time without latency, just because the interface can deal with all of that. But it's all about the buffer size.
I want to add here, because I mentioned how like the lower you get, the more direct you go. Like that direct monitoring is probably going to be quicker than no matter how low you set your buffer size, because it's immediate from like it's analog. It never touches the computer and has to think. Now, people tend to hear advice like that or facts like that and then think that that's obviously the thing they have to do. I think Benny and I both don't do that. I think we both use our computers because there's more advantages to that. It's worth the slight latency to be able to monitor through our DAW. So stay tuned and don't just start running out trying to figure out how to do that. It's not necessarily the solution. Could be, but it's not necessarily.
Exactly. All right, and then the other thing was check the phase. You also mentioned that, which is, it sounds weird, but you can be out of phase with yourself, basically. And it's worth, if something feels weird, or sometimes I had the situation where the singer asked me just to turn him up or her up on the headphones, and I did that, and nothing really seemed to change, or it didn't make the change that they were hoping for. And the reason for that was that if it's out of phase, even if you turn it up more, it won't get a lot louder. So I just started, and I didn't do that for a long time, but I read it somewhere, and then I just started flipping the phase on the vocal channel, which on its own, like in the context of the mix, doesn't change anything, because there's no other thing that is, like, there's no phase relationship with any other element in the mix, but it changes the phase relationship between what's coming out of the headphones and what the singer hears. And sometimes that did the trick. Like, I flipped the phase, and all of a sudden they were like, oh, now I can hear myself. And so that it's not often, but that can do the trick. So just check it. It's worth it. And just use the position of the phase knob that works better.
Yeah, totally. I just built it into my setup. We set a gain, we get a rough headphone volume, and then I say, I'm just going to click a button a couple times. You just keep saying the same word. And when it sounds fuller, just be like this one kind of thing. Just let me know. And then we'll leave it like that. And that kind of solves it. It's like, it's already optimized then. And that's what that's kind of what they'll be listening for, is it should just sound a little fuller. And again, closer. It feels more attached to you.
Yeah, exactly.
Because
So now we get into the things that are, so these were the basics, just being able to, like, no phase issues, no latency issues, stable connection, no noise, all of that. So now we get into, like, some other things that you might not have thought about before. So, or that a lot of people don't really think about. So the first thing is a well-balanced mix. So the mix that they are hearing on their headphones, I think, definitely is important, and definitely changes how they perform. Like, you want to prepare a great headphone mix for them, and you want to do that in advance. So I don't think you should. I think you should put some work into that and make sure that they hear that what they hear is exciting, and that it's like that they want to record to that, and it gives them confidence and all of that. So I don't know how you feel about that, Malcolm, but I think the rough mix is important. Yeah.
I think it's hugely important. I think it was CLA said that every time you click play, the client should be hearing like what sounds like a finished mix, and that is while they're producing a record, and that's so true. So, like, the only time things are out of whack is when it has to be so that somebody can track to it. But you finish that guitar tracking, it gets ducked down to where roughly it should live. So it's constantly building a mix, and you might throw it all out the window when you actually do a final mix. But along the way, it's crucial. that your mix is balanced. So, there's no exception with vocals. You should have a great sounding mix for them to sing to. I think I mentioned that I I want the mix to sound really finished for me, especially while I produce somebody else's vocals. I do start with that though. I'll probably be in before the band, make sure things are sounding how I want them. I might kind of do some pre-mixing, getting drums more compressed and whatever, just so things are leveled out. And then that is that's always my starting point. I send my mix to the vocalists. And then generally all they want is the vocal louder than I want. That's usually the real difference between my mix and their mix is just the vocal volume and the effects volume on the vocals as well.
Yeah.
But really it's because I've done that pre-work of making the instruments balanced, they don't have to say anything about that. It's yep, that's great, thanks.
Yeah, totally. And I think the most important thing about a great headphone mix is not necessarily all the details. So I'm just saying that because I know there's going to be listeners who will then spend way too much time perfecting every single detail about the mix. It's not about that. Not every single automation move and every single thing has to be there. Not even every plugin, but the basics, a good balance, volume balance more than anything. Panning that makes sense.
Yes.
Compression, if it changes the feel, as you said with the drums, if you need the drums to pump a little, or if you just need some consistency and add the compression, you need to achieve that. Get rid of distracting frequencies with EQ, but don't go crazy. You don't have to refine it.
No,
it's just a well balanced mix. Basically, that's what you want.
Yeah, there's a really easy to reach threshold of balanced that just needs to be hit. It's by no means finished. It's just got to be oh yeah, this is that sounds about right.
Yeah, exactly.
It should take no time at all. It's just grab the fader. There we go. I do understand that is easier said than done when you're getting started. But that's a skill to work on. Just quickly balance a mix. Boom, boom,
Absolutely.
boom.
And the cool thing is, if you're a self-recording artist, self-recording band, and you primarily work on your own stuff, then your own genre, the instruments you use, and all of that probably don't change as much as they do when you work with different artists. Which means you can pretty easily build templates and track presets and stuff like that for yourself that you can then use in your sessions. So you can get a pretty consistent, good sounding rough mix every single time if your whole setup doesn't change that much, which is a huge advantage. I would invest time into building these tracking templates and presets that I can then use over and over again. That is actually huge. I mean, it's just your band that you're recording, so you really know what things are supposed to sound like, and you can build that in advance. So don't start over from scratch every single time you record.
Yeah, for sure. Great point. I have another rabbit hole to go down, I think. Yeah. Not a big rabbit hole, but just a little bit of one. This kind of we're getting more into the technique of building them a mix. But I've done it both ways, and I think when you first start trying to build a separate mix for your singer, so you say you're the guitarist in your band, you're recording your vocalist, because you're not all just one person listening to this, but so some of you aren't the vocalist, but you do all the recording, and this is kind of for you. Your instinct and maybe lack of experience with doing two mixes might lead to you being all right, you've got your headphones on, I'm going to turn up the drums, or the kick even, the kick drum alone. You're really specific. You've got an output on every track, and you're just tell me when it's a good volume. And they're okay, that sounds good. All right, now I'm going to grab the snare. And then, okay, let's bring in some toms. How is that volume? Okay, cymbals. And it's 30 minutes later, drums are done. That's great. And now let's go to guitar. Is the left guitar loud enough? And every time I've done that and gone really detailed or even more vague and been okay, here's drums. Does that seem right? Here's guitars. Does that seem right? And build a mix for them. And they tell me when they're good. I then have listened to their mix and been oh, this is so bad. You can't sing to this. You're lying. You have no idea. You're just nervous.
Great point.
I mean, how do I say this? You can't let them decide what the mix is, but you also have to let them decide what the mix is.
Yes.
So that leads me back to my previous
point. I think
you have to do the mix for them first. Just throw on their headphones, build a mix, and be here you go, and then you can tweak from there. Otherwise, it's like a dog's breakfast every single time. It's crazy.
Absolutely. And then they will tell you if they want things louder, and that's totally fine. But then they have a good starting point already, and any changes should be minor. But if you start from scratch and let them do the work, then I mean, and you can't blame them. They don't know what they're doing. They assume that what they want is the right thing. But you should you are in charge of that. You have the responsibility to make a good headphone mix for them. So definitely, good point.
And even if you have the luxury of like a little self mixer, like if you get to work in a studio, sometimes you have like, oh, here's one labeled drums, I can turn that up or down. You still have to just rough it in for them, and then you can be like, okay, you can tweak on your own. It's in your hands now. But you can't expect them to build a mix ever. Ever.
Yeah, and this is actually a great
and it's
segue.
Also way quicker.
Yeah.
It's just so much quicker to do it for them as well. I'll add that. Okay, I'm done.
No, all good. It's perfect. And I love it. And this is a great segue to the next point, actually, because there are things that a vocalist most of the time doesn't know, or like doesn't want to think about while recording, that you should know when you track them. These are things like how the volume of their voice versus the volume of the backing track, for example, changes the way they perform, for example. And these are things that you have to make those decisions and not them, because they don't even know that, or they don't want to think about those things. But you can sort of guide them without them even knowing by just changing their like things in their headphone mix. And what I mean by that is, like, first of all, the overall volume of the headphone mix. This is something I think people perform differently when they have like a quiet headphone mix or a very loud headphone mix. And then there's the volume relationship between themselves and the backing track. So, for example, if I feel, let's say we have dialed in a good mix that everybody likes and they sing to that and it works, and then there's some part where I feel like the singer is just not putting enough energy into it. It's just a little too quiet. It's not just that the energy is not there. I want them to push a little more. The way to sometimes do that is to just lower their own volume on the headphone mix a little bit, so that they have to feel like they have to push harder in order for them to hear themselves. And that makes them sing louder sometimes. So that can be a trick like that. Or the other way around, if you feel like they should like calm down a little bit and it's just too much energy for the part, turning them up more will cause them to sing a little quieter oftentimes. So you can do things like that. And these are things that you have to make, you have to decide that. And there are like, you have to know that this just changes the performance, basically. And the fact that they are telling you that they want them to be as loud as possible doesn't mean that it's the best thing for the part of the song. Sometimes you actually don't want to make them so super loud, or the other way around.
Yes. Yeah. So. Totally agree. That's like advanced mode. Like you're a lethal vocal tracker at that point. You're like, oh, I'm going to manipulate you into singing what I want without even having to say it.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly, totally. It happens live too. Like, I think most people who have ever performed live know that situation when the monitoring is not great and you don't have in-ears, but you rely on the wedges on stage and it's just not loud enough. You can't hear yourself properly. What you automatically do is you start screaming more, and then oftentimes it happens that, you break your voice or something, or like this can really ruin a show. Sometimes I've had this happen with my bands where our vocalist would just scream like crazy because he couldn't hear himself properly, and that would like ruin his voice on the first day of the tour or something like that. That the way you hear yourself definitely changes the way you perform.
Right. Yeah. 100%. Other instruments too.
Yeah, totally. So the next thing, Malcolm, now we're getting into the whole make them feel like a star type of thing, make them sound great in the headphones. And the two things that come to mind for me are compression and like effects you use. And these are two categories for me, because when I say effects, I mean things like reverb, delay, stuff like that. And then there's compression, which is, it's separate for me. And can you explain why, or do you do that? Like why compressing their voice and feeding them a compressed signal of themselves, like why that is important or changes things?
Yeah, I think the reason both compression and things like reverb and delay are used on a vocal is really just to make it sound like they expect it to sound.
Yes.
We've all been listening to finished records for our whole lives. So when we go to record our vocals on a song, we expect it to sound like that. So if we don't have compression, or we don't have, reverb or delay, it probably won't sound like that. It'll sound way more dynamic and way more raw, and the wrong kind of raw.
Yeah.
So it's distracting. It doesn't inspire a lot of confidence. So that really comes down to it. And then from flipping it onto what I like about having compression and reverb and delays figured out while we're tracking, is that it's also just speeding up my job, because it's like, it's going to have to be there eventually. Why wouldn't it be there now? Like I just want it to sound finished. So the compression for the singer, though, is like they won't even really know it's happening. It'll just make them sing better.
Yes.
Or it can. And it's another thing that kind of changes how they sing as well.
Yeah.
Because it levels things out. So they might sing into it and kind of try and push through it. Some people do, or some people kind of actually do the opposite because vocal seems louder, so they sing softer, and that's actually a little more problematic. I find I have to trick them more. But
it also solves.
Yeah, you go ahead.
Sorry, no, go ahead. I thought you were finished.
I am finished.
Okay. So it also solves part of the volume problem because it just, as you said, it evens out things. And then when they go from a louder part to a quieter part, they can still hear the quieter part. And if you don't compress things, they might be like, oh, like in this part, I can't hear myself anymore. And you have to turn the vocal up and down and things like that. And with compression, it should be consistent enough so that they are always audible. Like it just, that alone is worth it. And then it's fascinating how much the sound of compression, not even the consistency, but the sound of it, how much that is part of what we all know and love in our favorite records, and how we are used to that, even if we don't know it. A vocal that's uncompressed in most of like rock and pop music and all the subgenres just sounds like raw. It just sounds like a demo. It doesn't sound like a record. And as soon as it's compressed, and oftentimes heavily compressed, it starts sounding like what we are used to from records. And it's fascinating like how important that actually is. So it's not just, it's about the consistency and the evening things out, but it's also really about how compressed vocals just sound like, and that we all like that. And it immediately will make them feel like they will feel like it's a better performance. They will like what they do more if it sounds more like a record, I think.
Agreed. I totally agree. Just anything that distracts them from thinking about how it sounds, really.
Yeah.
They shouldn't be concerned about it. They should be concerned about just doing the singing.
Like
so getting it in that ballpark. Important.
Totally. And how do you do that? Like, how do you compress a vocal that you can then feed to their headphone mix? I think there's a couple of ways to do that. The first one would be hardware. If you happen to have like a hardware compressor, you can do it before you even go to the mic pre, or like after, not before the mic pre, but after the mic pre into the converter. So you can do that.
The least flexible of options, right? Because that's going to be on everything after that.
Yeah.
Or like I have a UAD interface, so I can choose to monitor a compressor before my DAW, and I can make that so that it is actually recorded to my DAW or not, and it's just something they hear. Or I can do it in Pro Tools in my DAW, where I have it on the track and it's monitoring compression, not printing anything in that case. And that's probably the most flexible environment for me there, because I could technically have a duplicate that is not compressed that they're hearing or whatever. There's a lot of options there, really. For me, 99% of the time, if I'm compressing their vocal, they're hearing it as well. Like I've never really found a need to have that separated out for them, just for them or just for me. It's kind of like, that's just part of the capture. It's more the effects, like reverb and delay, that might be different between what I hear and what they hear.
Yeah. So just to explain really quick what those methods mean. Like if you go through the hardware, it's like printed onto what you record. Like it's part of the signal. You can't change it. It's just part of what you record. So it's not flexible. You have to know what you're doing. But it's gonna be on the recording. It's gonna be on everybody's headphone mix. It's just part of the signal. That's option number one, tracking through hardware. The other thing that you mentioned with the Apollo interface is the thing that we said about having an interface with built-in DSP processing, where the interface can run plugins, not your computer, but the interface can run plugins, and they are low latency or like zero latency, and you can then monitor these plugins but not record them, or you can record them like hardware, or you can do both. You can split it and record a dry and a wet version, basically. That is flexible, but you have to navigate like two software pieces, like you have to navigate the DAW and whatever comes with your interface. And then if you don't have an interface like that, or if you don't want to deal with two different things, then you can do the third option, which is putting the compressor on the track that you're recording to, and then feeding that track to the headphone mix. That means you have to go through the computer, through the DAW, through the plugin, back out to the vocalist. This always causes latency, and then so that it depends on the interface you're using and the computer you have. This determines whether or not you are able to do that, because it might cause too much latency, or you might be able to actually do that. I almost always do that. And this is where what you said before, Malcolm, where you take the little like added latency that you get from that, that's okay for you, and you take that because of the advantages you have from like going through the DAW and having it all in one system, and like being able to monitor your favorite plugin and all of that. So even though you could record with zero latency, you choose to have a little latency just because there's a lot of benefits to that approach. And that's what I do too. Like,
yeah, it's worth it. I'm the quickest at making tweaks if they request any changes that way. It's the most flexible. It's very easy to set up and have repeatable setups like templates and stuff like that. Yeah. For me, the tiny little bit of latency is totally worth it.
Cool, awesome. Then we get to effects like reverb and delay. I think part of it is also making it sound like a record, and like make things sit better in the mix. That's part of it. So not the obvious effect, but like just making it feel more finished and putting it into the mix a little more and not so much on top of it and so upfront and raw sounding. So that's part of it. But then also the other part is like the actual sound, and that depends on the genre and what they want to hear and stuff. So sometimes they want a very dry thing because that's just the aesthetic that you want. But other times they want to hear more creative effects and it just feels better. It makes more sense for the part, or, and it's also personal preference. So this is why you said, Malcolm, that oftentimes you want to hear a different mix than them because they might want to hear more or less of those effects compared to what you're hearing. So, and this is, by the way, something that you can do. There's a workaround for that usually, even if you can't, even if you're using, even if you have to use the wet dry knob on your interface. So even if you have to use the direct hardware monitoring because everything else is giving you latency, even if you have to use that, you can still use reverb and delay sometimes because you might not be able to use compression then, but you can do a blend of what comes back from the DAW with the direct thing from the preamp on your interface. This can even be done with the Scarlett or something like that, where you do the direct monitoring hardware thing, but then you also you don't activate the monitoring on the channel in your DAW, so you don't want to hear that because then you hear it twice with latency, but you want to activate the monitoring on an effects channel that you send the vocal to that has just the reverb on or just the delay on, and that will then have a little bit of latency, but it doesn't really matter that much because it's just the effect and that has a delay in and of itself. And you can then send that back and blend it with the direct signal on the interface. And that's a workaround that I often used when I still had like these entry-level interfaces, where I would give them the direct signal from the interface plus only the reverb or delay signal from the DAW, and so that they could at least have some effects on the headphones. So this is a workaround. I hope that makes sense and that people could understand what I mean here.
It works because those signals are already later than the vocal would be anyway, so it doesn't matter
that there's delay.
Yeah, exactly. So it's like, it's not really important that if it's showing up late, it'll still sound approximately like it would and isn't going to cause any bad phase stuff. So totally possible. That's a great tip.
Yeah.
We're intentionally skipping like types of effects and stuff like that, by the way, because we're going to have a follow-up episode on this where we discuss what we personally use in our vocal tracking templates for recording and monitoring. So that just, stay tuned for the next episode on that.
I'm just curious to hear, Malcolm, what is more often the case? Do they more often want to hear more of those effects or less of those effects compared to what you want to hear? Because you said that the difference is important for you.
Yeah, I don't know if there's a normal, actually. And again, I would say that I never ask them as a starting point, like, okay, I'm going to turn it up, you tell me when. I try to always have it roughed in. So I've got them the record a scratch line. I've kind of done a mix to that, just like dialed in what I want to hear on my side. And then I say, okay, how's this? And then if they request from there, I'll change it, kind of thing. So, and again, often that works. Often, if you do a good job balancing your own mix, they'll like it. But it's I don't know if there's, I feel like sometimes people just want it drier so they can really hear what's going on. Sometimes people want it more wet so that they're not really focused on what's going on. They're just singing. So whatever they need.
Yeah, but by the way, this is an example, at least I think so, and maybe you do it differently, Malcolm. I wouldn't be surprised if you did, but like this is an example where I think a traditional like send return configuration with the effects makes total sense, because then you can easily distribute the reverb to the different like monitor outs. So I'm just saying that because a lot of people are used to the workflow of just putting a reverb on the track and using the wet dry blend there. So when you're doing this, when you want to have separate mixes for different people in the room or for yourself and the singer, I would set up the vocal track that you record to, and then I would set up an aux or like an effects track with the effects on them, or like one for the reverb, one for the delay, whatever you have. And then you can use the sends in your DAW to make a second mix that, like, you use the faders to create your own mix, and you use the sends to create a second mix that you send out of the output that goes to the headphones. and then you can create that second mix like you would do a monitor mix on a live console. You create that second mix that consists of the dry signal plus the amount you want for them to hear of the delay and the reverb and stuff like that. So this is much easier for me to do if I have the reverb on a separate track. If I have the reverb on the vocal track itself, everybody here is hearing the same thing. So in that case, I would have to create a duplicate of that track and make different decisions there, which is kind of weird. So this is the one case where I definitely think it's better to use a send return configuration with the effects than having the reverb on the vocal channel.
I agree. Yep. That's totally how I do it. It also makes it easier to have templates, I think, and options, which we'll get into, but you want to be able to shoot out different things quickly.
Yeah. Cool. All right. Now, the next one, I'm curious to hear if you ever do that. Like we've talked about that in the past, but like maybe things have changed. This is an optional thing, I'd say, but I had success with it. Sometimes it didn't work, but like oftentimes it's worked surprisingly well. And this is if you have something like that, try making them sing into a real-time autotune plugin. Could be the actual autotune plugin or something else with the real-time capability. Because
Waves makes a good one.
Yeah. What that does is I don't mean like print that. I don't mean record through that unless you really know what you're doing, but that's really risky. But I mean like putting that on, like setting it up so that you can monitor that, but not print it if your setup allows for that. Some interfaces, again, can run that on their own DSP chips, or maybe you can set up a configuration in your DAW where, like same with compression, where you just put it on the track, but you don't record it, but they can hear it. And what that does is it's kind of, you know, when you sing a melody or like play a melody to somebody on the piano and you make them sing to that melody, you make them follow along with that melody, they are having a much easier time hitting the notes than them having to do it on their own without any guidance. And the same thing happens when they hear themselves tuned. They sing, the plugin corrects it, they hear the corrected version on the headphones, and they will automatically sort of follow along with that. They like a lot of times when people have intonation issues, this totally fixes it. They just hear a tuned version and they automatically sing better because they have this tuned guideline basically that they're listening to. It's like it's really weird, but also I think it makes perfect sense. So this is a great little trick to get people to hit the notes better and more consistently.
Yeah, I actually really like this trick. It's been useful a few times. So for me, I've got like auto tune in my Apollo. My Universal Audio interface has a DSP tuning plugin I can use. So that's been the one that I've used always. Again, monitoring, not recording it. It's just there for them to sing to. The analogy I've always used is like it's really easy to sing along to your favorite song on the radio because there's like a guide vocal to sing to, and this is kind of doing that.
Yes.
It snaps your vocal to the note, and then you just automatically adjust. Of course, there's exceptions. I would say this is kind of a 50-50 if they like it, and I just totally trust them on it. And some people are actually really smart and use it as like a tool for situations they're fighting hard. So like, do you mind just engaging that again for me? Let's turn the tuning back on while I try and hit this high note here. I think it'll help me. And then we're just toggling it in and out as a tool. So that's really cool as well. Totally. Pretty new age, modern stuff. I can't believe it's possible.
Yeah, totally. And it obviously requires them. So not that you think that this enables you to be just that this allows you to be lazy or like not sing well. This actually requires people to be pretty close already, because if you're too far off, it will snap it to the wrong notes maybe, and then things will definitely go sideways. So you have to be close enough so that the tool will actually put it on the right note, and then so no excuse. You still have to be able to sing well.
Side tip: if you struggle with hearing pitch, this is a good little safety check. Like if you think you've kind of got the vocal and comped it or whatever, throw on auto tune and auto mode and just listen to the song. And if any parts go wonky, look at those parts closer and see if maybe it isn't tracked well enough. Maybe it is, but if the tuner is reacting really weirdly, it's probably an issue that you should look at.
Agreed, 100%. So the last one that I added, I think, to this list was, and we kind of touched on that already basically, but it's important. It's just you as an engineer or producer or both, pay attention and change the mix based on the parts or certain challenges, things they're having a hard time with. Just pay attention. Just be there, focus. Don't like scroll through Instagram while you're tracking vocals. Just be present and pay attention to what's going on, because you might have to change things to solve a certain problem or to make them feel better in a certain part. You don't just assume that the one mix you dialed in is going to stay the same throughout the whole session. Just pay attention, be really there, and react if you need to react, and change things if you need to, I think. So this can mean turning the vocal up or down in certain parts, or activating, deactivating the auto-tune, as you said, Malcolm. Muting delays or reverbs for certain parts and then unmuting them for others and stuff like that. Just really pay attention and work with them, and give them also, make them feel like you are there and you're paying attention, because this can be pretty distracting too. If they are in the other room or even in the same room next to you and they feel like you don't really pay attention and you're on your phone or something like that, they will automatically perform worse.
For sure. There's all sorts of things that can affect how they're singing. There could be modulated instruments that aren't necessarily very in tune that are causing them to sing out of tune. Especially thinking electronic music where they detune synths to do all sorts of weird things that can really make it hard to sing to. So mute those out for that section. Or the other thing to watch for is timing. If there's a widdly guitar solo going on under the last chorus, it might be a little hard for them to lock into the groove of the song. And I mean, we all know that guitar solo should just be deleted anyways, but assume you're keeping it. We can mute it for the vocalist's sake while they record. So watch out for that stuff. That's a great idea. Yeah, I only had a couple more things that I think we could burn through pretty quick. But one thing that I've liked, and I actually don't have this set up right now, but if possible, have a way that you can mirror their mix to whatever you're listening on. So if they're in another room, it's really great if I can just click a button and hear out of the speakers roughly what they're hearing. So it's not my mix anymore, it's their mix. And just make sure nothing's weird and wonky. The delay is crazy loud. Are we sure we want that there? Let's turn that down. Stuff like that. Pretty handy. Often, I think for the self-recording band, people, they're just going to be beside each other and could just grab, the headphones and just throw them on and listen that way. That's the same thing. Benny, did you have something you needed to add there?
Yeah. I wanted to add that if you're, I don't know about Pro Tools or the other DAWs, but if you're in Cubase, please, guys, use the control room feature in Cubase and not just use the master out. You have to activate it, but Cubase has a control room that you have to activate if you want to use it. And definitely do that, because instead of using the standard sends and returns and using those as headphone mixes, it gives you Q mixes, which is the proper way to do it in Cubase. And the control room is like a monitor controller in Cubase. And what you can do is you set up the different Q, it's called Q mixes for the different people. It works exactly like sends and returns. It's just an additional pair, or additional certain number of mixes you can make. But anyway, you can create those. And then you have buttons in the control room that do exactly what you just said, Malcolm. I have it on mix. If I have it on mix, I hear my mix. But if I hit C1, then out of my monitors, I hear the Q mix number 1. If I hit C5, I hear Q mix number 5. I can monitor all those mixes, and I can put plugins on those mixes that are not in the session. They're just on the monitoring. So I could use an instance of SonarWorks for every single person in the room with different headphones or stuff like that. So the control room in Cubase is really, really cool, and it's not active by default. So you might not even see it. You have to go to the settings and activate it, and it's so worth it. This solves all, most of the things that we're talking about in this episode. You can do from the Cubase control room.
That's super cool. Yeah. They're so smart.
For sure.
All right. Yeah, so that's a handy one if possible, and it really just boils down to, again, checking that what they're hearing is actually something listenable. And then the next one would be, I just want to touch on this quickly, but some people don't track with headphones. They just listen to the vocals coming out of the monitors in the studio. I think the trick to doing that is having a mono mix, like a mono speaker, one speaker in the room, and it's phase inverted to your vocal so that it cancels out the music. I can't remember. I'm just blabbering gibberish because it's something I never ever have done. But I know that apparently that's how Pantera's vocals were recorded or something. There's these stories. Apparently people like it. I wouldn't be able to deal with a vocalist singing beside me, and I need the vocalist in another room.
Yeah, so Metallica did this on a couple of records, I think. He was standing in the control room with the SM7, pointing away from the monitors. They turned them up really loud, and he was screaming there. And this a couple of bands did this, so it works. Again, this is where dynamic mics come in really handy because they will reject the sound from the room better than condensers. All of that stuff applies there. And then the trick with the phase, I sometimes do that still when I do gang vocals. So sometimes when I do, in hardcore and in punk rock, we often have these gang shouts types of things, which is not really singing. There's a group of people shouting into the microphone. And it's in other genres too, but it's very common in the stuff that I do often. And sometimes we just want to have more people in the room than we have headphones for, or like things like that. And then there will be, exactly like you said, there will be a mono speaker. The mic will be turned away from that speaker. It will be as quiet as possible, but still loud enough so that everybody can hear what's going on. And then if I still oftentimes this will work just as it is because the people are going to be louder than that speaker anyway, and this doesn't really matter. But if there's too much bleed, then what you can do, what I've done successfully is, after the recording is done, I leave the microphone in the exact same place. I play back the backing track again at the exact same volume, and then I record that. I flip the phase, and I sync it up exactly to the actual vocal performance. So I line the two up, the timing up perfectly. I flip the phase of the second one, and it won't cancel perfectly because every single time sound travels through air, things change. But most of the time, at least the low end and some of the more noticeable stuff just goes away. And so that way I can cancel out the bleed from the actual recording by just playing it again into the empty room, recording that, flipping the phase, and blending it with the other recording.
Yep. Sounds like a pain in the ass.
Totally. But sometimes I got to do that. But like most of the times I don't. So for example, for our own band, we just did gang shots for a couple of a record that we're working on. And oh no, that's actually a bad example. We used headphones. But anyway, I do that often where I just have the speaker on, and I don't do anything about it. It's just quiet enough so that it's not a problem. The mic is pointing away from it, and you can get away with it. So it is an option to do that.
It's totally an option, so consider it. I thought it should be mentioned at least. Next one, and I find that trained vocalists really like this, is just slipping one headphone off. Maybe that's like just barely, but essentially what we're doing is just reattaching the room we're actually in to us and hearing our voice acoustically a little bit more than through the monitor mix. And that for people that are really trained and used to like feeling how their body reacts to hitting certain notes and stuff like that, they need that, it seems. So that can be, if somebody's just like having a really hard time, try that trick. It sometimes works.
Absolutely.
Then last but not least by a long shot, and I can't really believe this wasn't on our list, but setting up the room that they're singing in to be a good place to hang is essential.
It was intentionally not on the list, by the way.
Oh.
But like, go on.
Okay. Throw a salt lamp in there, dim the lights, whatever. Dimmers are kind of dangerous in the studio, actually. But have it be right. We don't want them. I once had to record in a studio where a mouse entered the vocal booth, and I can tell you that vocalist was no longer relaxed once the mouse had gone in the booth. Wasn't great. It was embarrassing.
Yeah, for sure.
So, if you can, make it a place they want to be, that they're comfortable. Your body being tense is bad for singing. So, we just need them to be in the right zone.
100%. By the way, the reason why this was not on the list was because that's why I said in the beginning, this could be a whole other episode. There's this whole thing of like communicating, how you communicate with the artist, how the room is set up, how the whole vibe of the session, things like give them, the microphone you choose. Some people prefer to have a handheld instead of standing in front of the mic. There's so many other factors that go into how someone can performs that I thought we should, this episode has been long anyways now, and I thought we should just focus on the headphone mix for this one as one part of it, and then maybe do another one at some point where we talk about all the other things, because there's so many factors that go into this, and you're totally right. The room vibe is one of the biggest ones, actually, I think. Yeah, but when I made the outline, I just thought if we're going to talk about all of the things that go into this, we could talk for 3 hours or so. So that's why I tried to focus on the mix.
Not wrong. Yeah. Okay, we'll leave it there then, I think.
Yeah, exactly. It might be worth doing another one on that sort of thing.
It's a great idea, because without getting too far into it, the producer is the thing that makes the vocals move along, regardless to how good the singer is singing. If they're nailing it and you are not telling them that they're nailing it, you're going to be there for hours and not get it done.
Yes.
It's all about the person in the chair. And that goes back to why the mix has to be in a way that I can hear that it's correct and finished. There's so much to the psychology of making a vocal session go well. So I think we should totally do an episode on that soon.
For sure, yeah. And it's so important that I even, like, if you are in the Self-Recording Band Academy, our flagship like online course, or if you're in my coaching program, at some point I have to change the names of those things because people always confuse it, but it's two different things. The one is an online course, the other one is my coaching. But in the academy, in the course, I have a whole module, or like a part of a whole module. It's a series of a couple of videos that is just about that, just about making sure that people that the room is a place that people want to be in, that the vibe is right, that they have what they need. Like even things, and yeah, we don't have to get into this now, but like down to things like having all the supplies and like water and food and like whatever you need for the session to run smooth, preparing well and making sure that everybody has what they need and feels great. This is so important that there's an entire lesson in the Academy online course. So yeah, let's definitely do an episode on that too pretty soon.
Yeah, absolutely.
Cool.
Absolutely.
All right. So I think, yeah, this was a little longer than I expected, but I think it was great, and I hope it was helpful. And I'm pretty sure that a couple of people thought it's all about like making sure that the vocal is loud enough. And hopefully now you know that there's a lot more that goes into this. And I will just say that it's very worth it to put in the work in advance, to prepare that mix, to do all the things we've been talking about. Because typically you have to practice it a little bit and you have to put in the work once. But once you have a setup that works and once you know all these things, your future sessions will go so much better and the performances will be better. So it's really worth it putting the time into getting these things right and putting some effort into your headphone mixes.
Totally. Yeah. It's always show up early on vocal day.
Oh yeah, exactly. All right. Anything else you have, Malcolm? Should we wrap this up?
Oh man, I could totally keep on going. I just feel like I shouldn't because like it's got to stop somewhere.
Yeah,
I'll save it for
Okay.
the getting a vocal session to actually get done episode.
All right, cool. And let's wrap it up. Thank you for listening. Thank you for watching. If you're on YouTube, share this episode with your friends. Tag us if you've shared it on Instagram. It's at Malcolm Owen Flood and at Benedikt. Comment on YouTube. Enter our community, selfrecordingband.com/community. And leave us a review, by the way. We should do more housekeeping like that. We never say those things. Like, people, please help us spread the word about this podcast. Share it.
Please.
Leave reviews, comment. Thank you for being a listener.
Yeah, thank you. We'll see you next week for episode 133. Wow.
Crazy. Absolutely crazy. Bye-bye.
Bye.